Hello, Professor Wills here. So I wanted to continue with our examination of the architecture of the late Roman Empire under Constantine. As you might remember, Constantine was considered the very first Christian Roman emperor. He enacted the Edict of Milan, which banned persecution from continuing of early Christians. And as his rise followed sort of the fall of the rule by four, or the Roman tetrarchs, and Constantine would reunify all the different corners of the Roman Empire under one ruler once again. He also, while in Rome, was known as not only a monument builder, but also the builder of other governmental structures and churches as well. So let's take a look at a couple of examples to see what was happening in this very busy 4th century era. All right, moving on to our PowerPoint here, I'll show you a remnant of a sculpture of Constantine himself. What you see here are just body parts, unfortunately. Let me make myself disappear for just a couple minutes as I introduce this sculpture to you. Then I'll show you the building that housed it. So what you find here is the monumental head of Constantine. It is monumental. It's over 8.5 feet in height. Overall a marble sculpture, but only what remains is sort of the elbow and bicep of Constantine. There's a little bit of a body part right here, but you can see not much more. This would have been a depiction of the emperor in a seated or enthroned position dating from the early 4th century here. Let me advance the slide one more time so that you get a sense of scale with this individual standing beneath it. Now, where it was displayed was inside this very large structure, and the name of the structure is Basilica Nova, or the Basilica of Constantine. It dates from circa 312. This is an artist's rendering of what it looked like with some cross-section, kind of dollhouse style, for us to see its relevant innovation use of the repeated groin vault with fenestration. This is something we haven't seen an example of, but indeed it was widely used in the Roman Empire. And because of the strength, remember, vaults are essentially expanses that don't require any kind of columns to hold up the roof, so to speak. And many of them were born from the arch principle. Of course, the idea, compared to a more vertical, horizontal post and lintel structure that we saw in Mesopotamia, we saw in Egypt, even in ancient Greece, what you find with the arch is that it displaces the weight not only downward, but to the side. So extending an arch creates a barrel vault, which you see here, a trio of barrel vaults on the side aisles. But if you look here, there is another arch shape here, and this arch would have continued on from one end of the building to the other, and the intersection of that barrel vault with the side barrel vaults creates the groin vault, right, which run perpendicular to one another. So this is a repeated groin vault formula that allowed the creation of what was not a religious structure, but a government structure in the era of Constantine. Now, you would enter from this side, and then on the end of the building is where you would find that enormous sculpture of the ruler himself. It's very evocative of, when you think of Greek temples and they would stick a big sculpture, when you think of the Parthenon and Athena Parthenos being the whole focus of attention for that religious structure, it almost seems like a throwback to placing a big sculpture of a powerful god, like the equivalent to the Romans of Zeus was Jupiter. So it has that kind of a look to it, but remember, this is not a religious building. This was meant as a kind of a government building here. But as an example here, because of the strength of these vaults, they are actually able in the upper levels to create a clerestory. Remember, a clerestory is something that was an Egyptian invention, and the fact that they can actually open up those walls and create fenestration to let air and light to penetrate this particular space means that they don't need a solid wall to hold the roof up, that these architectural innovations, these systems of vaults, whether barrel or groin or both, that came along in the Roman Empire, as well as the invention of cement, allowed them to cheaply and quickly and with incredible structural integrity build these massive monumental buildings. And how big am I talking about? Well, some of these, the vaults reach a height of 115 feet in height, and the length of the place is about 300 feet. So monumental structures like this become a commonplace in the Roman Empire, even in the late Empire periods. And you can see in the next photo here, I'll come back to you, hello, what the ruin of the Basilica Nova that you can see today in Rome. Look at those enormous barrel vaults with coffers inside, just like you would see in the triumphal arches. And then, of course, running down the middle that no longer is there would be the intersecting barrel vault forming this sequence of groin vaults. And, of course, the big statue of Constantine himself would be there. Now, with such heights, they did have to really buttress and have thick walls at the base of the building, some as thick as 20 feet, to kind of handle all that weight as a channel downward. You almost have to imagine, pouring a pitcher of water, a giant pitcher of water over the structure, and give you a sense of how that weight would flow down, how gravity would press down on something that large. But still, concrete, the innovation of these Roman arches really made a world of difference and took architecture to the next great leap forward that will continue until the present day. All right, looking at a quick artist rendering too, I wanted to show you, this looks like a real photo, doesn't it? But it's an artist rendering of what they think the interior of the Basilica Nova look like. So here you can see, for scale, a trio of figures, but here's the enormous sculpture of Constantine seated or enthroned, as the previous drawing illustrated to us. So you would enter the door and then again have a very central access, taking you from the entrance down to the end of this particular space here. But looking up, you can see a subtle X shape in a coffered ceiling that delineates the intersection of the two barrel vaults, forming the groin vault that I referred to. And then on the left and right would be the trio of additional barrel vaults. And of course, at the very top, there's an example of the fenestration, or essentially the windows, the grills that would allow light into these massive sanctuaries. And of course, the requisite Corinthian capital, a Roman favorite with fluted columns, providing additional support and decorative features in a space that would have been covered from end to end in the best marble Italy had to offer. All right, what about religious architecture? Well, let's move on here. And of course, there's a throwback to the Athena Parthenos, the sculpture that's forever lost to us. But that would have been another example of putting a religious god or goddess in a religious structure in their own space. But here it's about a government building and a ruler. But Again, the concept is very similar indeed. All right, moving on to another structure built under Constantine. He was known to build churches, and one very famous church that was built or begun to be built in the year 319 is called Old St. Peter's. Old St. Peter's, you can see in this artist's rendering approximately what it looked like, because unfortunately it's no longer with us. It was torn down during the Renaissance in the 16th century and rebuilt by none other than the great Michelangelo, when the Vatican at that time was eager to create a larger, grander, and more impressive sanctuary to underscore the authority and power and prestige of the Christian Church of the Renaissance. So whenever you watch the news and you might see Pope Francis, giving a speech or presentation or a sermon, usually right behind him is what they would call the new St. Peter's. But the old St. Peter's is important because it provides the plan for future church architecture, particularly in Western Europe. It's going to have a huge impact, particularly in medieval Europe, that we'll be talking about in a very short amount of time. So if you were a little bird flying above this church, you would see, looking down upon it, that it is in the shape of a Christian cross. That, of course, is a reference to the crucifixion of Christ. But the church here, built in Rome, where present-day Vatican City is, was built on top of the remains of St. Peter, an iconic follower of Christ who himself was crucified upside down here. And so it makes sense, of course, there are these religious references, including the actual footprint of the building, to a Christian cross. Looking inside, you would enter through kind of an open-air courtyard or atrium. You would enter one side of the building, a lot like the Basilica Nova, and then a lot like the Basilica Nova, you would proceed up number one, which is called the nave of the church. I know we like to call it the aisle, like walking down the aisle, but it's called the nave. And that would take you to where the altar would be located. And that's very traditional for a lot of Christian churches to this day. Number three is called the apse. This is a slight kind of a semicircular space that bumps out, while number four is called the transept. And you can think that kind of looks like a letter T here. This is where the relics, special precious objects relating to Christianity, relating to the saint, maybe an article of clothing, that would be venerated and worshipped in that location. On the sides, number two, are the aisles. So you can see in this view down below here how it would look. Now, what we're going to start to see with church architecture is that's so different from temple architecture, from the polytheistic era, is that there's more interest in getting people inside the sanctuary to worship than to have them worship elsewhere through, exterior rituals, or to venerate and worship a sculpture. That's the only thing that's allowed in a sanctuary, like in a Greek temple. Now in the era of Christianity, they're going to pack the house, right? To hear those sermons, to be moved by the stories of the Gospels, and all the focus, of course, instead of venerating an idol at one end of the church, is to focus on the altar and the person officiating the sermon and service. So in this kind of a church from another very similar era, oops, I don't have it with me. All right, taking us back, what you find is there'll be more embellishment inside than outside. Christian churches will look a little bit plain, actually, for a while at least in early Christian times. And all the focus will be on the interior decor. So that's something we'll be talking about from this point forward in the semester. And I look forward to sharing you that journey in the incredible art that we're going to be looking at. All right, thanks for joining me.